Welcome to a Theology of Christian Permaculture. My name is Sean, and we're going to continue going in depth over the first of the 8 basic ideas on why we need a theology of Christian permaculture, agriculture, ecology, and the such. And the first reason being that because the Bible is written in the context of an agrarian or an agricultural society. So today, 1 Chronicles 6:28 takes place, 2 Chronicles 6:28 takes place during Solomon's prayer in the dedication of the temple. And as he's praying, he says in verse 28, if there is any famine in the land, any disease, any blight, any mildew, any caterpillar, and if an enemy sieges or enemy lays siege to your fields, or any disease, or any pestilence or plague, that there are 10. I might have missed one in there, but there are 10 basic challenges that he lays out in this prayer. And then he lays out in the next verse, 29, the solution to all of these things. And in this whole passage, he's talking about the effect that our sin, both individually and nationally, but more so in this case in a national level, can have on many different aspects of life, including some of those just mentioned. That one of the keys of these things happening is that we would return and have a renewed dependence on God, and that's what the lesson is, generally speaking. But there are times that we're going to be faced, and there could be a lot of different reasons why we face some of these things. Some of these things are because of external choices. So other people around us may use certain types of chemicals that cause problems for certain types of plants, or maybe because things grow too densely, or because this a new species of something is introduced in the area, or because there's a diminished population of a certain bug, insect, bird, or another animal. Like one example is where we're starting to have a little bit of an overpopulation of wild rabbits. The reason being is because there seems to be a decrease in the population of things like the fox in this area, and possibly even the coyotes, though lately we've been hearing a lot of coyotes down in the gully in the backyard. Well, it's actually more of a ravine back there. So, there are many reasons why, but one of the main reasons can be when a nation that professes to be godly turns their back on God. And this is not actually any type of comment upon the American conception of what constitutes a godly or Christian nation. It has nothing to do with it. I'm mainly talking about within the context of 2 Chronicles 6:28, the nation of Israel, which was initially founded as a theocracy and then became a monarchy, in which the monarchy was supposed to be a representation of God on earth and to reflect God. But we know in the nation's history, here where it's Solomon, it hasn't quite split yet, but we know that wasn't reflected very imperfectly. But the things that were listed, blight, mildew, disease, plague, not so much, but even plague, disease, caterpillars. There was another type of insect there. Maybe it was moss. Check out that passage, 2 Chronicles 6:28. Moths. Those are the type of things that in creating a permaculture system that we are attempting to mitigate. we are attempting to keep these things to a minimum, to when they show up, deal with them immediately, to create biodiverse ecosystems within the area that we are stewarding that would be unfavorable to their uh, existence, that there would be different layers of from the underground insect layer all the way up to through the plants to the different types of um, birds and other animals that play into all this, and also the not using things like chemical treatments to eradicate most of these things. And that is the standard way that most of these things are combated. They're combated with chemical resources that end up harming the soil and the bacteria of the soil and the biology of the soil, and therefore create this loop in which more inputs are needed in order to make the soil healthy and fertile and viable, because all of its minerals are being depleted. Plus, that's not even to talk about how much of these things are being taken up into the plants, and then whether they're because they're sprayed many times through the foliage, so up above, and then they're also the ground is also sprayed to keep the weed pressure that would compete for it, compete with it. And so you add all these things together, and that goes into that plant, and that goes essentially into the food that we eat. So we're trying to mitigate a lot of these things. You have to remember a very important and vital aspect of all of this is that when these things come, most of the time, most people are looking for a quote unquote scientific solution. So, you have powdery mildew or you have your fire blight. So you go and you buy, or you have too many weeds. So you go and you buy a chemical treatment for the weeds. You buy a broad spectrum herbicide. So you buy they would buy Roundup. Fire blight, I don't know exactly what the treatment that they would use, but you would you use it to mitigate and to keep down the occurrence of fire blight. So for example, in strawberries, to control slugs and other pests, you might use something like atrazine to to control the insects and the bugs that compete and try to they're just naturally drawn to your crops. So that's the way that most people do it. They're looking for this quote unquote scientific way of mitigating these problems. Whereas Solomon says in verse 29, and if any person offers a prayer, he goes on to talk about this whole aspect of prayer in regard to these 10, and also before that, in verse 27, he's talking about when there's a lack of rain, so a drought would be included as well. So there's like 9, 10 things that are taking place that are very adverse, that really can affect the ability to grow crops and food, and even just to maintain something like a food forest, or even perennials, something that is a lot more hands-off as opposed to annuals and things like that. But he goes on and he says in verse 29, he goes on and talks about how prayer, that if any person prays, may you hear them, Lord. And and through all of this too, he's talking about when we confess our sin, hear us, Lord, when we've gone astray, and then after you've heard us, restore to us what is being bothered by all of these different challenges, because their essential goal is to get us to return, to be reawakened to God, to be dependent on Him. Because the thing is that we often look to many different ways to try to uh, do these things, how to control them, how to fix them. I mean, even in our crops, we're always looking for a way to make things grow faster, quicker. So we're pumping, everything full of steroids, essentially. We're giving it all this, fertilizer. And I'm not talking about compost teas or even, closed loop fertilizers that we've created, compost through like green materials and woody materials and all of that type of stuff. That's not what I'm talking about. So we're always looking for these different answers. Looking to these different solutions that are easy. But really, there's one easier solution, and the solution is for us to remember that prayer is like the most essential component of our permaculture structure, because in what we're doing, we're seeking to reflect God's care and provision, God's creativity, and we're not just looking to seek to maybe imitate those things, we're also looking to enjoy them, to enjoy the interaction that all of these things in his created order within these biodiverse systems that we're attempting to create, and how they interact with one another, and how they play on one another, and how they support one another. In that, we're being awakened to God. Let us not forget what is always needed too. And I know that I'm one that I tend to forget a lot. I see something that's going wrong, and I tend to try to react to that instead of stopping and observing. And I technically observe and then I react, but instead of observe, take a deep breath, offer a prayer for wisdom, insight, guidance, even thankfulness that there is this challenge before, because catching it early can cause it to can cause further problems to be alleviated later on. And even there's an aspect in here that many of these these things here are things that can really discourage us. But there are also sometimes things beyond our control. Sometimes like certain times of cycles of like locusts and cicada may affect a lot of things, and even still with that, the foods that they eat, the way we can try to mitigate total destruction, things like that. Growing like fields and fields of corn or fields and fields of this type of apple, whichever pest likes it just goes, wow, look at the smorgasbord that these people provided for me. So we're always trying to mitigate these things, but there's some things beyond our control. And so some of these things are like, invasion, or conflict. And during this time, you think about there's a raiding, people outside of the nation of Israel that would be coming in and taking the crops. And, if you resist, while they're coming in, taking the crops, and they're, messing with the people, chasing around, possibly many times even killing some of them, they're catching them at a vulnerable time most of the time, when they're out harvesting or when they're out planting, when they're, most of it I would say would probably take place more during a harvest period than it would during a planting period, because there would be something more advantageous than just the pure, the pure thrill and excitement of and I'm not talking about a good type of excitement. I'm talking about a debased, deprived, depraved type of entertainment. Of causing consternation or frustration, or making other people fearful. That harvest would probably be more because there's something more advantageous. So yeah, you get to satisfy those debased, desires for entertainment, for kicks, of of causing people a lot of pain and frustration and stress and worry and anxiety, uh, you know, both physically and mentally. But also you gain crops from it as well too. And this is something that we need to think about. Is a lot of times these things take place within border regions where crops are grown, where that's initially where conflict starts. And so and I'm not making any geopolitical or making any political comments. I'm just talking about a reality of it's in the world today, 2022. That the area of the not Crimea, even though Crimea does grow a lot of these same types of crops as well too. The border of Ukraine and Russia grows about 30% of, I think 10% for Ukraine, 20% for Russia, grow about 30%. This whole area grows about 30% of the global wheat supply. A lot of this is distributed within, areas that are more adjacent to that, Europe, Middle East probably, and, within Russia and various other areas. So this is an important area where 30% of the global wheat supply. They also grow a lot of corn, barley, spelt, and other grains as well there. This is like 40, 50, we're like somewhere in 50, 60 days, 2 months almost, getting close to 2 months of this taking place. So this means this means planting time is being pushed back, especially in Ukraine. Planting time is being pushed back, which means harvest time is pushed back. That 10%, of one side, or 30% total, can really have an adverse effect on the global food supply. And then the other thing that takes place with this is that not only will reserves be tapped into, but the reality is this. The reality is that on top of all that, we've seen the images of the buildings being bombed out, refugees, people fleeing. We've seen, a lot of the devastation of, this whole thing. Even, you see some dead bodies through the news reports and things like that. And on top of all that, longer term consequences of this are things like people's livelihoods, being diminished greatly, but not just livelihoods, their sustenance, their ability to eat and provide it, and possibly even longer term could be things like famine or starvation. These are things that we need to pray that these things don't happen, that these longer term consequences, and that for many reasons, we need to pray that things like this end end very quickly. And here's the thing, it's that's the whole point of all of these things. Whether it's the pestilence, the blights, all those type of things. We recently got a video that I'm going to be posting. It's part 2 of Everything Has a Season, and it's about a recent Bartlett pear that we had to remove from our orchard. There's blight, pestilence. There are caterpillars. The caterpillars, in many ways, are very beneficial and beautiful, and we have a big campaign to save the monarch butterfly. Here in the United States and North America. And but caterpillars are also can be very frustrating, to say the least, in what they can do. The tent caterpillars, damage they can do to your trees, other types of caterpillars that start that way, or maybe they're not technically like a caterpillar, they're a little creeping. They bore into your fruits. I mean, there's a lot of aspects that these things can be very, 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 very frustrating. diseases, plagues, even famine. And then, like we just talked about, conflict and invasion, captivity sometimes, even too, being taken away to another place. Not willfully leaving as a refugee. I mean, you're still not technically willfully leaving. You're leaving because you want to get out of there, but being forcibly taken out and placed someplace else, like like Israel will be in several hundred. I don't know if it's a several hundred, 100, 200 years, something like that. So remembering that prayer is the key aspect, the most important foundation to our permaculture, agricultural, ecological endeavors. That in them we get closer to the mind and the heart of God, and seeking His wisdom and understanding on how to cope with the various challenges that arise. And then also on what to do with the abundance He gives, because we're going to find out there's a passage a little bit later on that talks about being careful of how much you try to profit, and especially during specific times, off of the abundance that you get. And there's a balance. Is all I'm trying to kind of hint at. If we're going to be biblical, there's a balance. It's not saying that we can't, make a living and even make a decent or comfortable living doing it, but we can't let it consume us, that it becomes our focus, that we rely on that more than we do on God. And we forget about things like prayer. Even when we, like I said, even when we meet various challenges, instead of reacting, take a deep breath, step back, pray, continue to observe, remediate when you need to, and just repeat. So God bless you, beloved of the Lord. May the Lord bless you. May He keep you. May He cause His face to shine upon you. May He ever be radiant toward you, and may He give you peace. God bless, beloved of the Lord.